Welcome to Lunar Burn Studios. My name is Eric Stevenson, and today we're going to talk about lost wax casting. In this first video of the series, we're going to talk about slush casting a wax in a rubber mold. The pattern we're going to be working with for this series of videos is a human skull. The reason why I actually like using this pattern is that one, it's a skull and it's cool, and if you're going to have extra objects running around, it's kind of cool just to have a pile of skulls in the corner. Or in this case, kind of lining up on my back shelf here. But what's nice about the pattern itself, it checks a lot of boxes for things that we want to be able to talk about during the casting process. In this case, it's a combination of, we have a nice amount of detail across the teeth and the bridge of the nose. It also is going to be a hollow casting, so we can talk about a certain amount of core. And ultimately, it's just a nice size object to be working with. So to generate this pattern from this mold, we're going to do what's called a slush cast, meaning that we're basically going to fill up this chamber in the mold with molten wax, literally slush it around, roll it around, and then pour it out back into the wax pot, let it cool, and then we'll do another coat, another coat, another coat. Typically, I know that with this mold, I can get away with about 5 coats of wax. The wax we're going to be using this evening is a microcrystalline wax, which is most known for specifically foundry, or at least in art casting realms. Part of the reason we like it is that it has a wide range, temperature range, and so when we first start off, at room temperature here, it's stiff enough that it actually holds a nice surface, and it's not inherently sticky. So what is it? It's about 70 degrees in here. It has a nice surface to it, but at the same time, whether we heat it up under a heat lamp, using metal tools and heating them up under flames, ultimately chasing this wax and getting it ready for a casting. But we can also, as we're generating a variety of wax shapes, we can collage different waxes together and make larger, more complicated castings. But this material has that versatility and that ability to be able to be worked at a variety of temperatures and a lot of different plasticities, softnesses. So anyway, we're going to, in this case, I'm using a little deep fryer for making French fries, whatnot. The reason why I like using the little deep fryers for melting my wax is that I can melt up a pot of wax in a little under an hour. Another handy way to do it is with a crock pot. They're a little bit cheaper, but it also takes several hours for that crock pot to bring up a pot of wax to the right temperature. So a crock pot's what, 10, 15 bucks. These fryers are, can be anywhere from like 25 to 50 bucks. But for the amount of time you save and how quickly, if you want to be able to use multiple pots of wax in a day, these kind of pots are going to serve you a little bit better. If you want to ultimately go the more commercial route, there are, but you could easily spend more like $500 to $1,000 depending on their size, capacity, and temperature range. From past experience, I know that this mold will take roughly about 5 to 6 coats of wax. So my first coat of wax, I typically like to start off at about 240, 250 degrees. A little bit higher if I have my details a little bit more delicate or deep. A little bit cooler if I have a little bit smoother surface. So I think right now I'm dealing with about 240 degrees. Ultimately, I'm using a little cooking thermometer. Actually, I believe it's actually more for candy, so it actually goes up to about 550 degrees. I'll ultimately leave links for all these tools in the description below. But the thermostat that comes with it, on the wax pot, on the controller unit, is reasonably accurate, but it's nice to actually have something where you can actually see that temperature and have a little bit more finite control over it. So we're dealing with the temperature about 240 degrees. One of the things we want to work on is, as we introduce the wax to the mold, we don't want to just like splash it and jam it into the mold. We want to introduce it in a very smooth, very controlled manner. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to tilt the mold up and pour, so we can introduce the wax so it slides down the back of the skull, and as it hits that back wall, it'll easily fill up that chamber. If we went perpendicular and just kind of splashed it in, we're going to hear a lot of gurgling, a lot of noise, a lot of turbulence that ultimately with the wax into the mold, which will generate distortion, porosity, and other casting issues that we'll have to fix later on down the line with the chasing. So one of the things we need to do as we, before we start slush casting the wax, is that we want to take the mold, break it down into its parts, because that will open up the mold. And so since my mother mold is made out of plaster, I want to prevent the wax from actually sticking to it as we slush cast our mold. So one of the characteristics of plaster is that it's extremely porous. And when we pour molten wax onto it, it's going to act like a sponge and seize onto the wax, which makes it almost impossible to clean off. It just makes it more of a challenge when we get down to doing it if we're using this mold over and over and over again. So what we want to do with the plaster is actually take the mother mold, and I'm going to put it into a bath of water. And if the mold's been on the shelf for a couple of weeks, months, years, it's going to be bone dry, and it's going to absorb quite a bit of water. You'll see bubbles being released and coming up from the surface. You want to leave the plaster in the water till no more air bubbles are coming up, and that way you know it's completely saturated. In this case, since I've been working with the molds the last couple of days, they were already fairly saturated, so it'll only take a couple of minutes in this situation. So what we're going to do, we'll drain out some of the water. One of the things we can deal with is that, you can see the flexibility of this rubber. It's ultimately about a 1/4 inch thick. I have a little bit thicker on the outside flange, and I've also beefed it up, and so it's a little bit thicker on the seam where I've cut. And that broader surface area on the seam allows for a better registration. If that edge is just a 1/4 inch thick and we make our cut, then trying to get two little thin pieces of rubber to try to mate, we're going to get a very defined edge, and it's going to generate a lot more cleanup for us when we get into the chasing. So I beefed it up there. So as we pull these things out, we'll line that up, grab the other piece from the water. Line these up, make sure the seam is nice and tight. And then we'll re-screw up the mold. We'll put the screws back into it. I like using the screws to bind my molds together. It's just a little bit more secure, especially when molds get a little bit larger and you're rolling around and trying to slush them. If they're bound together with rope or ratchet straps or rubber bands, old inner tubes, or whatever the case might be, they can either slip or snag or break, and suddenly your mold is opening up and you're getting a chest full of wax, or in my case, I've done it where I have wax getting up in my beard and whatnot. I'm going to say it's less than a pleasant experience. So I was around doing that once or twice was enough, to learn the lesson, and that's ultimately when I started using screws. And so what I'm doing is they're just actually just machine screws with a Phillips head, which is why I'm utilize the drill. And then instead of an actual nut, I'm using a wing nut, so I can actually use my hand to grab onto them. So I'm not using two tools, a wrench and a screwdriver. It just makes it a little bit quicker. So anyway, so now the mold is prepped. Saturated so the wax won't stick to the outside edge, and we're ready to start spinning the wax. Tilt the mold kind of back up on the edge. I'm just using a little saucepan to grab my wax. I kind of shaped it so it has a little bit of a pour spout. Again, I'm just going to come in from the back. First coat, I'm going to go a little bit slower. than maybe some of the subsequent coats. But again, this is the first 1 or 2 coats are going to be really about my detail. So I want to be controlled and methodical. And yeah, you can hear a little bit of kind of gurgling as it's kind of going in it, but you want to, the goal is ultimately to keep that noise down to a minimum as an indicator. And then I'm just going to roll this around, establishing my detail on my pattern. And then the other thing I'm going to do as I start pouring it out, instead of just pouring it all out on one edge, I'm actually going to roll it around so the wax drains over the circumference of the full edge of the pattern. And part of the reason I'm doing that, well, you can see where I got a pretty decent coat, but you can still see a little bit of the mold coming through the wax, but that'll get covered up on the next coat. Draining the wax over the edge of the mold initially is to actually help trap the wax onto the surface. If I poured it out just off the front edge of the, or one edge of the mold, like I said, as we heat everything up, it expands as it's cooling down, it's shrinking. And so if all it's sticking to is just the inside edge of the mold, it has the potential of pulling away and curling that edge away from the surface of the rubber. And so when we go in and pour the next coat of rubber, there's a chance that it's going to flow behind your first coat and the rubber, and it just screws things up. It winds up melting the previous layer. You wind up getting a kind of weird delamination look or multiple layers. Anyway, it's just not good. So what we want to do is do whatever we can to keep the wax trapped out on the edge of the molds until the end of the casting process, and then we'll trim off that wax to reveal the ultimate thickness that we're shooting for. So I'm going to let this cool down. Okay, been about another 10 minutes or so. So we're going to do our third coat of wax. Wax temperature's down about 210. So now that we've established our detail coats, we can move along a little bit quicker. And these last couple of coats will go even quicker and stuff, more like 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes in between coats. And then we're ready for, as we're letting things cool, we'll just continue this process. Fourth coat. Fifth coat. Now that we have 5 coats slushed into the mold, we want to be able to check kind of what our overall thickness is. So I'm going to take my spatula, just heat it up. Doesn't need to be too warm, but enough to cut through the wax. I'm just going to come along and trim off around this edge, and we can see where the reveal is about 3/16, 1/8 of an inch as an overall thickness. It's ultimately always going to be a little bit thicker at the mouth of the mold, because it's been it got coverage both on the wax going in and going on the wax coming out, so it builds up a little bit quicker. And so the pattern's probably a little bit thinner up inside in the skull, around the eyes, and the top of the head maybe a little bit. But better to actually have your casting just a touch on the thin side, because you can always thicken it up. Once the wax is too thick, it's really tough to actually try to harvest out any additional wax. So now that we have a decent thickness in there, I'm going to go ahead and just trim off the rest of this. Throw that back in the pot. Now to cool the wax down, if I was going to go ahead and, if I was at the end of the day, I would just go ahead and just set it off to the side and open it up tomorrow morning. But in this case, if I also wanted to, if I was in a rhythm and I was cranking these things out, 6 to 8 a day, what I could do is actually go ahead and put it back in here in the water bath, and then go ahead and fill up the cavity with cool water. We'll just let that sit there. And realistically, after 5 minutes, put your hand into the water. If it's heated that water up, go ahead and pour that out, pour in some fresh water. It's a nice way to kind of force cool the wax to facilitate the process. Otherwise, you're looking at probably about at least a half hour, 40 minutes or so before it's cool enough to pull out. If it's too warm, there are some undercuts up underneath the cheekbones. Up under the cheekbones and around the nose and whatnot. And so if everything's still too warm, as you pull out, it's really going to catch on those and probably pull that detail off or break them off. So you really want your wax to be fairly cool. Now that this has had a chance to cool, we'll go ahead and open it up. I like putting my screws and keep my washers and the nuts all in one unit, so as they're kicking around on the table, I'm not searching for them. So the way I want to do this is go ahead and open up, pull off the two halves of the mother mold. And the way I like to open up this mold, because I have the seam just running around over the back side, is just opening it up, putting the seam towards me. I'm just going to slowly kind of flex the mold and giving it time to kind of release on its own. I don't want to force it and rip off any of my details prematurely. There's ultimately just a little bit of vacuum, so you want to be patient with it. There it goes. So yeah, so now we have yet another wax skull. It looks like it came out reasonably well. A little bit of a seam on the top, but that'll be a good example to chase that out. Yeah. And it served us well, doing the slow wax initially. I don't see too much, kind of porosity or anything. A few little things to fix, but overall, we'll call that a good casting. We have a nice, it's about, nice 1/8 inch thick, so just what we were shooting for. So that's pretty much it for doing the slush cast of the. So now, so that worked out well to actually generate our pattern for this series. And so what we want to do is, as a final kind of maintenance things for the day, we don't want to just have even though we might be coming back tomorrow, we don't want the mold just to be sitting around open. Because of the plaster and the way we, saturated it with water, if we just let it lay around for a day or two, it could potentially distort. The plaster is really not that thick. It's a little bit thicker, about 1/2 inch thick up here along the seam, but out here on the surface, it's really only about an 1/8 inch, less than 1/4 of an inch. And so it actually can be fairly plastic. We think of plaster being rigid, but it can actually be a bit fluid and plastic on its own and stuff. So what we want to do is just go ahead and throw our molds together so everything stays in the shapes that we want them to stay in. And for a short term, whether it's tomorrow, next anytime this week, I'm fine with just leaving the mold as is. If I'm going to do any kind of long-term storage, where it's going to be more than a month or a year in between castings, you want to slush coat, do a few coats of your wax in your mold and all that. So because the rubber itself can potentially degrade depending on the quality of the rubber you're using. Some rubbers, as they age, actually break back down to a liquid or want to distort and whatnot. So what we can do is cradle or keep that rubber entrapped. So we'll use obviously the mother mold on the outside, but then use a a wax pattern on the inside of the mold. And it'll just maintain the integrity of the rubber and also keep it from being exposed to the environment. Depending on where you're storing your pieces, you'll find that your molds will last a lot longer as a whole. Okay, so we'll do the final assembly. So yeah, so then that mold's good to go. We have our wax pattern. So for the next video, we're going to talk about wax chasing. And what I mean by that is we're going to show you 5 techniques on eliminating and making the wax pristine. Because we're using ceramic shell for our casting, the ceramic shell picks up all details. So anything that's in the wax will be in the metal. So we want to make sure that we have what we want. So we're going to eliminate the seam line across the back of the skull, some of these positives, a few of the negatives, some of the porosity. We'll talk about a variety of techniques that are going to fix all those kind of defects in the pattern, and ultimately make this pristine, ready to go pattern for the spruing, which is the plumbing system, and we'll get into that as well and stuff. So thank you for joining me for this video, and I would like you to join me for the next video where we'll be talking about wax chasing. And until then, be creative and be safe.